53. 2. Afterthoughts, Memory and History. This chapter deals with several aspects of memory and history or the Nakba. In this context, the instrumentalization of Zionist biblical archaeology, which, in all events, is an ideological construct that does not establish rights, will be discussed in order to refute the contrived competition of who was here RST. A second aspect relates to the construction of collective identities and to the specificity of national identity. A third is the political importance of remembering Palestine before the Nakba. It is not just to help identify the modern Palestinian polity, but also to make it absolutely clear that the Palestinian question did not suddenly arise in 1967 and that the political solutions the Palestinians have accepted or are expected to accept are compromises. In order to explain the historical context of Palestinian national identity, this chapter takes a closer look at the distinction between collective identities and the structures that reproduce them, and between the history of the land and national history. Concerning national rights, who needs archaeological nationalism? 1. Since the Nakba, a whole political culture has developed around the question as to which people have the right to the land of Palestine and what the nature of such a right might be. His book defends Palestinian rights in the land and to the land of Palestine. It brings to bear a combination of humanist and national modernist approaches and is based on Palestinians physically being there, uninterruptedly for centuries, going about their daily business, cultivating the land, building the cities, reproducing a culture in interaction with nature and history, and developing national aspirations. He writes of the native Arab population living in Palestine long before the Crusades are a product of long historical interaction and merging of ethnicities, tribes and communities with a shared Arab-Muslim culture in a land without political borders, like all other countries of the Levant and North Africa. Palestinians are an indigenous native people who had already developed a national consciousness and polity before being exposed to politicide and expulsion by a form of settler colonialism. I used the phrase native indigenous people with national consciousness, and not only indigenous people intentionally, because settler colonialism indifferent. 54. Countries acknowledged defeated native populations are a long struggle as indigenous to people. Is an achievement, of course, but not for a people who were already in the phase of national liberation struggle against colonialism. Is the term usually used to denote natives who had not developed a national movement in the modern sense, and national aspirations before they were overwhelmed and annihilated as a people, physically and socially, by a strong modern settler state, leaving them with, at most, meager compensations, cultural rights, respect for their memory and identity, at least in democratic countries, and, of course, narratives, if they wish. What they do not have is a communal right to self-determination and full authority over the land. A proclamation of indigeneity became a very important component specifically in the struggle of the Arab citizens in the State of Israel itself, who are denied the status of indigenous people. Is part of the Palestinian people, needs the affirmation of indigeneity for its own identity and pride, and in their struggle for their civil and communal rights in a state that was built in their homeland and in which they became a minority. 3. Palestinian national identity and struggle has been a well-documented historical fact since the Palestinian Congress, held in Haifa on 13 to 19 December 1920. The Congress was attended by representatives from different Palestinian cities, towns and villages, and by members of various Palestinian Islamic and Christian associations. Participants affirmed national demands and pledged support for the establishment of an independent national government. EY also elected an executive committee to oversee the development of the national movement in the coming phase. It is clear from the closing statements of the Palestinian Congress that its authors had in mind the San Remo conference held earlier that year, in April, and the French colonial occupation's overthrow of the King Faisal government in Damascus in July 1920. For of particular note, the Congress resolved to abandon the Greater Syria Proposition, which had been one of the most important resolutions adopted by the original 27 members of the First Arab-Palestinian Congress in 1919, 5 in favor of the establishment of a Palestinian national government. Palestinian national identity crystallized under the British Mandate. Is not to say that they had no nationality before that. EY were, and still are, Arabs, not just ethnically, but also in their national aspirations. 6. In contrast, the 55 national development of Israelis was mostly state-driven. Our independence in 1948. A Zionist-organized settler society, the Yishuv, laid the foundation of the state by integrating Jewish immigrants from different countries, nationalities, and even different ethnicities into a conscientiously constructed Hebrew culture as part of a colonial venture that conceived of itself as part of a state-building project for a single people. Palestinian rights to the land are not derived from a claimed genealogical descent from the Canaanites or any other people living in Palestine in ancient times, including the Philistines from whom the land's name was taken. Nor is the Jewish Israelis' right to live in the land of Palestine derived from a purported genealogical or spiritual link to ancient Israelites. Modern Israel was established by force and not by rights. As members of religions, followers of Islam, Christianity and Judaism, and other religions have inherent religious rights, which is also a modern concept, but this does not confer the political rights to form a state. What is proclaimed as a right for a state is a national right. Palestinians have them by virtue of the two rights mentioned above: a long and continual presence on the land and the right of a people to self-determination. Jewish Israelis achieved these rights by virtue of building a state to host the generations of Jews born in Israel since 1948, and who now have no other homeland. National rights of the Jews in Palestine did not exist before the emergence of the Israeli state. A state retroactively accomplished the critical task of building a nation able to claim it possessed national rights but still unable to indigenize itself due to its colonial and apartheid character, an unsolved Palestinian issue. Why not take the founding of the Zionist movement and the RST Zionist Congress in Basel, 29 to 31 August 1897, as the starting point? Is only works in terms of the nationalist vision, not their nation-building dimension, especially when we consider that, in 1897 and 4 decades afterwards, Zionism was a fringe movement supported by only a small fraction of Jews in Europe, while those in Asia and Africa were not even in the picture. Until the late 19th century, Jewish European secular politics were dominated by the Haskalah, a political culture that believed in enlightenment and the modern state. It secularized the medieval doctrine of Dinar de Malkuter Dinar, the law of the kingdom is the law, and turned it into a historical rationale for the Jews' loyalty to the states in which they lived. 7. Haskalah. 56. Culture entailed the notion and the yearning that the Jews would accept their conditions of modern citizenship. 8. Jewish intellectuals therefore tried to integrate the history of their own communities within the national histories of their European homelands. In Germany, France and Hungary, they were influenced by the national historical discourse in their countries 9 and strove to be a part of it. Evidence also indicates that they developed a homemaking myth that would strengthen their roots in the local motherland. 10. Representation of Jews in European socialist movements and among emancipatory cultural elites was also much higher than their share of the population. These historical discourses prevailed until the interwar era. Deep contradictions in European societies, ethnic nationalism and political populism continued to produce antisemitism, but the most dominant reactions to it were integrationist egalitarian trends and, antithetically, the religious isolationist trend. But Zionism was there, too. It drew on integration, nationalism and isolationism. It was influenced by European nationalism, not in the direction of integration, but rather towards separation. It sought to establish a nationalism of its own, out of the belief that Jews can only integrate among the civilized nations of the world by constructing a European state, separate from the other European nations. Its vision could only be implemented outside Europe. Until World War II, Zionism was but one of many competing ideological trends among Jews and generally one of the smaller political movements. 11. There were also liberal, socialist and communist assimilationists, Jewish non-assimilationist socialists, Bundists, who were anti-Zionist and yearned for national cultural rights or achieving socialism in their countries, and Orthodox and traditional anti-nationalist Jews. A waning of liberal values in the interwar period and the rise of fascism and Nazism strengthened Zionists, who preached a solution for the Jews outside of Europe. EY reduced Jewish history to a fabled biblical period that was further idealized into a golden age of Jewish sovereignty. On this, they anchored their nationalist claims, while ignoring the nearly 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple or writing it off as no more than a history of suffering. Rejecting exilic medieval Judaism as a fundamentally apolitical and subservient culture, the founders of 57 modern Israel sought a synthesis between the image of ancient Israelite power and the lessons of European nationalism. 12 However, the narrative that sees Jewish political history through the prism of Zionism only became dominant among Jewish scholars, or the State of Israel achieved a degree of institutional solidity, physical security, and economic well-being unsurpassed in its history. 13 The Jewish state could monopolize the means of education and implement its views in their official curriculum instructed in its schools. 14 David Myers addresses the role of the founding generation of scholars of the Institute of Jewish Studies of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in projecting a new and coherent Zionist historical consciousness onto history. 15 A systematization of the Zionist grand narrative of Jewish history that turned Jewish histories interwoven with the histories of different peoples into one monolithic national history leading from the Second Temple to the State of Israel. Zionist archaeological propaganda is an ideological construct that tries, in vain, to prove Jewish continuity in Palestine since before the so-called biblical times. It may serve as a basis for producing a nationalist religious political culture, but it is irrelevant to legitimizing modern national rights. Palestinians are wrong to try compete with it by producing their own ancient histories of Canaanite ancestry. A myriad peoples and ethnicities passed through and lived in this land over the course of millennia. A natural product of this complex and uninterrupted weave of historical, cultural and ethnic interaction was already in Palestine when the Zionist pioneers arrived. It was the Palestinian Arabs. His very presence establishes their right to the land. It makes no sense for them to play along with a contrived archaeological competition. A Palestinian national collective as a modern identity. The origin of the modern Palestinian identity, according to Baruch Himmeling and Joel S. Migdal, can be traced to the 1834 revolt against Ibrahim Pasha. 16 Rashid Khalidi argues that, during the period from the start of World War I to the beginning of the British Mandate, Palestine experienced a strong and growing national identification with Palestine, as the Arab residents of the country increasingly came to imagine themselves as part of a single community. Nevertheless, Khalidi conceded that 58. This identification was certainly not exclusive for Arabism. Religion and local loyalty still remained extremely important, and continued to make it possible for Arabs in Palestine to also see themselves simultaneously as part of other communities, but it did constitute a new and powerful category of identity that was simply non-existent a generation or two before, and was still novel and limited in its diffusion before World War I. 17 Yehoshua Porath countered that the ideology of national self-determination anchored in separate historical and linguistic identity was a revolutionary innovation in Palestine in the 20s, and it is highly doubtful if it could have been grasped by the less educated section of the community. 18 Although Mohammed Mosley held that Palestinian nationalism was not a priority for the Arab elites in Palestine in the 1920s, he linked the rise of Palestinian nationalism to both local concerns and the unfeasibility of materializing Arab nationalism in a state. Arab political elites, Palestinian, Syrian, and Iraqi, were confronted with two forces, the push of Arab nationalism and the pull of local nationalism, he observes. Having failed to translate their universalism of the pan-Arab doctrine into a concrete reality, they resigned themselves, some painfully and begrudgingly, to the overwhelming pull of local concerns and priorities. Nationalism, which was linked with a specific piece of land and a specific group of people, prevailed. 19 According to May Litvak, the Palestinian historical discourse underwent significant changes over three distinct periods of time. ERST period was from the 1920s to 1967, when the discourse favored a pan-Arab narrative. Second was from 1967 to 1994, which marked the revival and crystallization of a distinct Palestinian identity within a broader context of Arab nationalism. A third period began with the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority in 1994, which did not deviate from Arabism and Palestinianism but tended to overstress links to their Canaanite past. 20 Tarif Khalidi stated that much of the historical work produced by early Palestinian historians was antiquarian, having no other ostensible purpose than to unearth or record various aspects of Palestinian and Arab history and culture. As the mandate progressed and was perceived to be dedicating itself to the realization of the Jewish national home, their antiquarian scholars became more nationalist. Ever since, history became a national legacy to be used for. 59. Reinforcing the ongoing debate with the Zionists and the British over the issue of the right to Palestine. 21. Serious Palestinian research was conducted to demonstrate not only continuous inhabitants of the land over the centuries, but also to trace the formation of Palestinian collective identity back to historical phases even earlier than the 18th century. Is certainly an important research project in terms of the history of the land and the communities that lived on it, but it is irrelevant to national identity, which is a modern political identity. There were several pre-modern religious, sectarian, tribal, regional and other collective identities in Palestine, but the national identity is a modern construct. My suggestion here is to distinguish between 1. History of the land and national history, 2. Collective identity in general, and modern nationalism that seeks political expression of this identity through a state, thereby reproducing it as a national identity. 3. Sharing and mutating constructed collective identities, on the one hand, and the tangible political, social and cultural structures that reproduce, politicize and consolidate collective identities, on the other. Modern institutional structures, without which discussion of national evolution is impossible, are accessible to empirical research. However, such research must apply this critical distinction between the living collective identities and the macro structures that enable human agents to reproduce them as national entities, and as national cultures not solely dependent on subjective feelings of affiliation, in order to identify how these factors interplay and theorize their implications. There have always been collective identities in the land of Palestine, but before the British Mandate there were no political, social and cultural structures that could produce and reproduce a single collective identity, one that united Palestinians and fused their local identities into a people distinct from those in neighboring countries. That is, Palestinian identities before their Mandate era were not nationalized, i.e., reshaped by nationalism towards political expression in a sovereign state. These structures arose on a Palestinian national level and in a national territorial framework under the British Mandate, and took the form of modern political organizations, political parties and a national leadership, economic associations, banks, business, 60 companies, trade unions, Palestinian daily newspapers and cultural and educational institutions. Together they forged the collective Palestinian cultural and political identity in the land of Palestine. Nakba endangered this collective identity, but a dir and response soon arose in different forms, most notably the PLO. History and historical speculations outlined above indicate not only an existing nationalist sentiment, but also the development of a national identity by the people who lived there, whose history permeated the history of the country that shared their name, fully exempting the Palestinians from the need for ideological archaeological competition or for harkening back to imagined ancient ancestries. Memory and amnesia. Nakba represents a rupture not only in Palestinian modern history, but also in modern Arab history because, in the ermith of defeat, the dialectical relationship with Israel began to displace and, ultimately, serve as the G-leaf for the internal dialectic. Arabs were staggered by what had happened, but the overwhelming shock became the start of the new partisan ideological pan-Arabism, as opposed to the intellectual and cultural pan-Arabism that spread from the end of the 19th century to the RST half of the 20th century. In general, Arab regimes did not try to analyze and explain the defeat in Palestine. EY tended to consider it a historical glitch, a fabrication cut from the same cloth as their so-called State of Israel itself. EY even avoided saying that name, let alone calling it a state, using instead such terms as Zionist entity, or Zionist band, or the presumed State of Israel, etc. In the 1950s, military coups in Egypt, Syria and Iraq brought an abrupt end to the so-called liberal era in Egypt and the Levant. Mutinous officers who led the coups had participated in the failed 1948 war 22 and personally experienced the formative shock. A defeat in Palestine was widely perceived as a fiasco that was blamed on unpopular ruling elites dependent on ex-colonial powers and on the myriad of other failures of the former regimes, and it was no surprise that the officers explicitly mentioned the 1948 defeat in their RST communiques and promised to liberate Palestine. The independent Arab countries and states that emerged in the boundaries shaped by colonial partitions did not unite in an Arab state or union, but nor did local national identities replace the wider Arab identity. Moreover, their 61 Palestine cause became an important unifying component of the Arab identity in this fragmented reality. Since then, it has become clear that the rise of local identities in CONICT with Pan-Arabism casts doubt on the centrality of the Palestinian issue. A question of Palestine fundamentally altered Pan-Arab ideology. Heretofore at peace with itself, seeking to bring together peoples with a common language and an imagined shared history, it evolved into an angry political ideology that grew all the more radical as the fragmentation became more obvious in real life. A strident Arab nationalist movement would quickly acquire enormous impetus under the modernizing Arab military regimes of the 1950s and 1960s. Commemoration and timing. A Palestinian calamity and cause have remained present in innumerable ways in Arab politics, literature, and popular culture. However, for decades, annual commemorations of the Nakba were infrequent in the Arab world, except in refugee camps. Since the 1990s, Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel inside the Green Line 23 held annual commemorations in the form of marches of displaced Palestinians who had been prevented from returning to their villages they had or were expelled from in 1948. 24 annual march was launched in the aftermath of their 1993 Oslo agreements between Israel and the PLO when, according to which it was understood that Palestinians in Israel were allowed as an internal Israeli issue. 25 EN, on the 60th anniversary of that formative event, Nakba commemorations were held on a large scale in many Arab countries. EY were a manifestation of the increasing concern among large segments of public opinion that something was missing in the relationship between Arab officialdom and Palestine, and the growing alarm over the fate of the Palestinian cause and the welfare of the Palestinian people. Sentiments, which were also expressed in solidarity demonstrations with Gaza against the blockade, 2007 present, and against the Israeli bombardment of the heavily populated Strip, December 2008 to January 2009, also contributed to the build-up of the grassroots rage against repressive police states and their failing social and economic policies which erupted in the Arab uprisings in 2011. Commemorations were motivated by other factors as well. One was the Arabs' dawning realization that they lacked a sense of direction and that fundamental issues were at stake but had been forgotten during the endless 62 backing and forthing between regional powers over their peace process. More troubling was the Palestinian intinger or the 2006 PA legislative elections which degenerated into an armed confrontation between the Fatah and Hamas movements in 2007. A third factor, which may have served as a nail straw, was the provocative visits by Western and non-Western heads of state to Jerusalem to take part in Israel's Independence Day celebrations. East leaders needed to be reminded that they were actually celebrating the humanitarian disasters that befell the Palestinian people with the creation of that state. 2008 commemorations of the Nakba were thus a kind of back to basics campaign. It was at once a reassertion of the collective Palestinian Arab memory and an instance of reminding others of the basics. Palestinian refugees' right of return, for example, was among the most essential basics that needed to be reiterated at that time. His right had been universally recognized in 1949, long before the emergence of Palestinian militancy, the establishment of Fatah or the PLO, let alone Hamas, which only surfaced officially during the RST Intifada in December 1987. 26 Many have questioned the insistence on commemorating the Nakba in 2008, the same week that the world's gaze was drawn to the civil war in Iraq or a devastating occupation that had destroyed the country, with numbers of victims far eclipsing those in Palestine. just as the number of victims in Syria since 2011 exceeds those directly caused by colonizing Palestine. So, what is so unique about Palestine? Palestinian people are not any more or less unique than other peoples. Are not God's chosen people. On the contrary, they face an occupier who explicitly claims title to a state on their land on the grounds of a divine manifestation to a chosen people. If the Palestinian question has any similar claim to uniqueness, it is in the dubious honor of being the last true colonial con-ICT on earth. In the age of decolonization, Palestinians fell victim to a cellular colonial project that has no colonial power to return to, that considers Palestine to be its long-lost motherland 27 and that monopolizes the role of the victim even when it is the victimizer. There is another crucial reason for remembrance. To forget pre-1948 Palestine is to concede that the con-ICT suddenly arose in 1967, that it is solely a border con-ICT, and that the Palestinians and Israelis are equivalent sides in this con-ICT. Is historical amnesia was a prerequisite for the Oslo process. 63. And its consequences. Forging the Zionist occupation of Palestinian territories in 1948 makes it possible to turn the Palestinian and Arab demand of an Israeli withdrawal from 22% of the land, the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, 28 into a starting point for negotiations, rather than what it is, a historic compromise. Forging 1948 also lends itself to erasing the refugee issue from the international and regional agenda, as some are keen to do, despite the fact that it has always been an international issue, as was Israel's founding. After their expulsion from their homeland, the Palestinians rightfully clung to international resolutions relevant to their plight, such as the acknowledgement of their status as refugees and their subsequent recognition of the Palestinians as a people with the right to self-determination. Recall that the Zionist leadership's acceptance of the UN partition plan in 1947 was a ruse. EY could not visualize a Jewish state with an Arab population of about 45%, and they had their sights set on more territory than allocated to them under the partition plan and on an overwhelming Jewish majority in that territory by expelling the Palestinian majority. Palestinian refugees continue to live with the loss of homeland, citizenship, basic rights, and suffer the consequences and hope for the future. Keeping the memory of this alive is crucial to the process of seeking proper justice and redress. Political memory and folkloric memory. Remembering pre-1948 Palestine is not a commemoration of an imaginary lost paradise that existed before the Nakba. Palestine was not a paradise. Creating a myth of a lost paradise is a folkloric memory that also turns the Nakba into a surprise victory of evil over good, a natural disaster as a form of divine curse upon this paradise. Romanticized memory overlooks the historical reality of emerging towns and cities and transforms Palestine into an intimate and cohesive collective of cozy villages. Is there reminiscence of the Fedain 29 Turs, the majority of whom were descendants of peasants. Memory of Palestine was an idyllic pastoral one, the simple hard-working peasant who had tilled his elds, tended to his ox, and now, gun in hand, fought for his land. It is no coincidence that his head cover, the Kuyar 30, became the symbol for the struggle. In the refugee camps, residents of the same village cultivated the village memory as a 64 link to the homeland and bequeathed it to the next generation, including those who led the camps. A vast majority of pre-1948 Palestine was rural. It was a simple and underdeveloped or sufficient local economy country, and it lacked internal cohesion. 31 But it was waking up to gradual modernization and modernity. A more modern education system was accompanied by various technological advancements. There was a burgeoning middle class that was partly linked to the educated youth of the traditional aristocratic families, trade in the port cities, and new business employees in the mandate institutions and the urban Palestinian Christians. 32 Palestinian cities such as Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem were starting to flourish. 33 The idea of a Palestinian people with national aspirations was materializing in tandem with the emergence of an educated elite, some of whom had relocated from the countryside to the cities in order to gain an education. 34 There was also a growing urban labor force, accompanied by the growth of a bourgeoisie and a middle class. 35 Irishing Palestinian cities in the RST half of the 20th century were living testimony to the rising modernity that was interrupted by the mass expulsion and the founding of Israel. Not only was the land not empty, it was rapidly urbanizing. 36 In every rebellion against British colonialism or Zionist settlement, it was the peasants who served as the backbone of the resistance. Peasants became intensively politicized whenever the link with their land was threatened or severed. Then became politicized as refugees, their personal dreams now an issue of international relations, their hopes of returning to their villages subject to the whims of politicians, international decisions and global and regional power dynamics. In the refugee camps, they sustained kinship and identikation based on affiliation to their lost villages, but the rhythm of the seasons and popular religious celebrations was replaced by an international conference calendar, endless news broadcasts and interminable speeches by politicians promising liberation. As time passed, their homes in Palestine became the objects of yearning and nostalgia for the second generation of refugees. Armed operations of the Fedayeen were organic activities of homegrown underground movements whose origins had nothing to do with Arab regimes. At the same time, refugee conferences were held and political 65 institutions evolved based on a national Palestinian identity. Foremost among these was the PLO. One nationalist archaeology attempts to project a contemporary nationalist conception of history onto ancient times, turning back the clock to imagine an ancient power and underpinning modern nationalism. Is the ahistorical ideological cultural project that I call archaeological nationalism. Some Donitians confuse ethnicity and nationality in order to be more affirmative or politically correct. Take for example the following Donitian. Generally, indigenous refers to those peoples with pre-existing sovereignty who were living together as a community prior to contact with settler populations, most OEN though not exclusively Europeans. Indigenous is the most inclusive term, as there are indigenous peoples on every continent throughout the world such as the Sami in Sweden, the First Nations in Canada, Mayas in Mexico and Guatemala, and the Ainu in Japan tend to remain culturally intact on their land bases. Indigenous peoples refers to a group of indigenous peoples with a shared national identity, such as a Navajo or a Sami, and is the equivalent of saying the American people. Confusion here reacts noble intentions. See Native American and Indigenous Peoples FAQs, UCLA the 14th of April 2020, accessed at hps://bit.ly/3 Northwest MKNH3. See also, Nidam N. Ruhana, Homeland Nationalism and Guarding Dignity in a Settler Colonial Context, Palestinian Citizens of Israel Reclaim Their Homeland, Borderland Journal, Volume 14, Number 1, Spring 2015, pp 1-37. Conference concluded its statement with a national charter, which called for continued Arab opposition to the Zionist policy of establishing a national home on the basis of the Balfour Declaration and for Jewish immigration to Palestine to be halted. It also endorsed the establishment of a national government that would be accountable to a parliament, whose members would be elected by the Arabic-speaking residents of Palestine. See Abd al-Wahhab al-Kayarli, Documents on the Palestinian Arab Resistance to the British Mandate and Zionism, 1918-1939, Arabic, 2 NDED, Beirut, Institute for Palestine Studies, 1988, pp 16-19. Conference endorsed an executive committee, led by Musa Kazem al-Husseini and his deputy Arif Pasha al-Dajani, and tasked it with supervising the progress of the national movement. Bayan Nuwayhid al-Hawt, Political Leadership and Institutions in Palestine, 1917-1948, Arabic, Beirut, Institute of Palestine Studies, 1986, pp 139-43. 5 Held on the 27th of January to the 9th of February 1919, the RST Congress brought together representatives of various cities and regions across Palestine. Arif Dajani, president of the Islamic Christian Association in Jerusalem, was elected as chairman, and Rafeb Arbu al-Saad al-Dajani, founder and president of the Islamic Christian Association in Jaffa, was elected as his deputy. A conference issued a petition that was then submitted to the Paris Peace Conference. It stated, "We consider Palestine nothing but part of Arabian Syria and it has 66 never been separated from it at any stage. We are tied to it by national, cornea, religious, linguistic, moral, economic, and geographic bonds. We desire that our district southern Syria, or Palestine, should be not separated from the independent Arab Syrian government and be free from all foreign influence and protection. We deem every promise or treaty heretofore concluded with respect to our country and its future as null and void." Olhout, pp. 95-7. 6. A personal note. The author experienced an absurd occurrence that had to do with conceptual confusion involving this. In 1989, when I was still a lecturer in Birzeit University in the West Bank, I participated in a debate on Israeli TV on the concept of in Hebrew, Umr in Arabic. A term nation is usually translated to Umr, an old term which originally had a different meaning. Is a common enough practice in translation and is considered acceptable as long as the new use of the term gains currency, and a new and generally accepted term has not been coined. However, sometimes when an old term is used, the connotations of the term can be a source of many misunderstandings and it can also be misused. In Arabic, the term Umr is used to signify the Arab nation, but originally it was used, and is still used, to designate those affiliated with Islam. During that TV program, I said that there is no Palestinian nation, and that different Arab nations are an invention of colonialism. There is an Arab nation, and I am an Arab nationalist, not a Palestinian nationalist. I added, "We do not say Palestinian nation, we say Palestinian people." 30 years later, an American Zionist right-wing group posted a video clip of that segment of the program on various social media with the disingenuous comment, "Even Azmi Bishra denies the existence of a Palestinian nation." 33 years later, Arab regimes that were upset, to put it mildly, by my outspoken support of the 2011 Arab revolutions when they erupted discovered that video clip and had their internet trolls circulate it again. I did not respond because their intentions were obvious, and my struggle for Palestine and my writings were too well known to be harmed by the propaganda of authoritarian regimes that have covertly and later overtly allied with Israel. Their cheap propaganda leaped on a single term in translation and took it out of context. EY did not bother to consult my writings or recall my well-known positions. Others apparently forgot they, themselves, do not use the expression Umr Falastinier, Palestinian nation, but rather Shabi Falastini, Palestinian people. The same applies in Hebrew, by the way, Am Falastini and not Falastinate. When the famous Israeli PM Golda Meir made her notorious statement in which she denied the existence of a Palestinian people, she said, "Ein Am Falastini, and not Falastinate." In Arabic, Palestinians, Syrians, Jordanians, Iraqis, etc. use the word Shabi to describe their country affiliation. So, we say Palestinian people, and we do not say Palestinian nation. People who use Umr to describe such an affiliation were once accused of collaborating with the colonial attempt to divide or partition the Arab nation. When Palestinians want to express love for Palestine and devotion to their homeland, they usually use the term Watani Falasatini or Watanier Falastinier, which can be translated to Palestinian patriot. They would never say Kormi Fasatini, Palestinian nationalist. There was nothing out of the ordinary in what I said on 67. That TV program. What was unusual was how my remarks were seized on, distorted by retranslation and cuts, by both right-wing Zionists and right-wing Arab regimes. I returned to this subject 8 years later in the last chapter of my book on civil society, A Critical Study Arabic, Beirut, Center of Arab Unity Studies, 1996, in which I argued that we should separate the concept of the nation from ethnic nationalism and strive to build nations of citizens in the Arab countries. I stressed that the Arab affiliation remains a basic cultural identity component of the Arabs and their ethnic nationality, which should be distinguished from state nationality, which should designate citizenship and not any other affiliation. 7. David Biarley, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, New York, Schocken, 1986, page 103. 8. Ibert, page 113. 9. Guy Myron, A Waning of Emancipation, Jewish History, Memory, and the Rise of Fascism in Germany, France, and Hungary, Detroit, Wayne State University Press, 2011, page 7. 10 Iberd, page 8. 11 Biarley, page 145. 12 Iberd, page 150. 13 David N. Myers, Between Diaspora and Zion, History, Memory, and the Jerusalem Scholars, in David N. Myers and David B. Ruderman, eds. A Jewish Past Revisited, Reactions on Modern Jewish Historians, New Haven and London, Yale University Press, 1998, page 90. 14 New Iran, Zionist Historiography and the Invention of Modern Jewish Nationhood, A Case of Ben Zion Denor, History and Memory, Volume 7, Number 1, 1995. Page 115. 15 Myers and Ruderman, eds. See also, Gabriel Pitterberg, E. Returns of Zionism, Myths, Politics and Scholarship in Israel, London, Verso, 2008, Chapter 4. 16. E. Tough Rule and the New Reforms led to the 1834 revolts outbreak in the heart of the country, uniting dispersed Bedouins, rural sheikhs, urban notables, mountain fellahin, and Jerusalem religious Gurs against a common enemy. It was these groups who would later constitute the Palestinian people. Kimmeling and Migdal, page 7. 17 Rashid Khalidi, Palestinian Identity, A Construction of Modern National Consciousness, New York, Columbia University Press, 2010, pp 149-50. 18 Yehoshua Porath, The Emergence of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, 1918-1929, London, Frank Cass, 1974, page 307. 19 Muhammad Y. Mosley, The Origins of Palestinian Nationalism, New York, Columbia University Press, 1988, page 214. 20 May Litvak, Constructing a National Past, The Palestinian Case, in May Litvak, ed. Palestinian Collective Memory and National Identity, New York, Palgrave Macmillan, 2009, pp 97-133. 21 Tarif Khalidi, Palestinian Historiography, 1900-1948, Journal of Palestine Studies, Volume 10, Number 3, 1981, page 64. 22 All the leaders of the RST military coups in the Arab world, Husni ul-Zaim and Adib Shasharkli in Syria, Nasser in Egypt and Abdel Karim Qasem in Iraq, fought as officers in Palestine in 1948. 68. 23 Lines of the armistice between Israel and the Arab countries in 1949, which then became the de facto borders of State of Israel. 24 Palestinians forced to leave their homes but remained within Israel's borders are categorized as internally displaced and were later granted Israeli citizenship by the 1952 nationality law. A 1950 absentees property law categorized these Palestinians as present absentees, along with others who led the areas by the Zionist militias even for a short period of time between the 29th of November 1947 and the 15th of May 1948. Nimr Sultani, Illegal Structures of Subordination, in Nidim Ruharhar, ed. Israel and its Palestinian Citizens, NY. Cambridge University Press, 2017, page 202, or were not in the Jewish state during the census of 1949, when the truce borders were not clear yet, is euphemism bestowed the legal status of absentees on people who had never left the country and who clearly remained physically present. Is law also transferred internally displaced Palestinians' properties to the custodian of absentees' property, as if they were absent. Refugees located outside the country. Israeli policies have systematically prevented absentee Palestinians from returning to their homes or lands. Writing on IDPs, Hillel Cohen estimates the number of internally displaced Palestinians in the early 1950s to be around 25,000, roughly 1/6 of the total Palestinian population in the country. Although a lack of official statistical data makes it difficult to precisely estimate their current number, the Battle Resource Center has estimated it at about 420,000, along with about 350,000 in the occupied territories. See Hillel Cohen, A State of Israel versus the Palestinian Internal Refugees, in Nirmasalher, ed. Catastrophe Remembered, Palestine, Israel and the Internal Refugees, London, Z Books, 2005, pp 59-60, Nirmasalher, A Politics of Denial, Israel and the Palestinian Refugee Problem, London, Pluto Press, 2003, page 143, Hillel Cohen. Internal refugees in the State of Israel, Israeli citizens, Palestinian refugees, Palestine-Israel Journal, Volume 9, Number 2, 2002, pp 43-51, Warkim, E. Internal refugees in their homeland, present absentee in Israel, Arabic, Palestine. Studies Journal, Volume 45-46, Winter 2001, page 93. Survey of Palestinian Refugees and Internally Displaced Persons 2016-2018, Volume LX. Survey, Battle Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, November 2019, accessed at hps://bit.ly/3tn6 Cohen notes that the UNRWA was mandated to conduct relief and works programs to support the internally displaced in Israel between 1950-2. In this period, UNRWA relief services were managed by the Red Cross. The Israeli government assumed responsibility for taking care of refugees within its borders. Israel viewed the termination of the UNRWA and Red Cross 1949-52 mandate in political terms, allowing UNRWA activity amounted to a recognition of a refugee issue. As a result, the internal refugees were removed from their UNRWA scroll and were registered in the Israeli population censuses as belonging in their villages and cities of refuge, not of origin. Hillel Cohen, present absentees, Palestinian refugees in Israel since 1948, Arabic, Beirut, Institute for Palestine Studies, 2003, pp 68, 99, Cohen, State of Israel versus the Palestinian internal refugees, in Catastrophe Remembered, page 65. 25 Nadim N. Rouhaner, Homeland Nationalism and Guarding Dignity in a Settler Colonial Context, Palestinian Citizens of Israel Reclaim Their Homeland, Borderland Journal, Volume 14, Number 1, Spring 2015, page 22. See also, Nadim N. Rouhaner and Arish Sabakoui, Memory and the Return of History in a Settler Colonial Context, Case of the Palestinians in Israel, Interventions, Volume 21, Number 4, 2019, pp 527-50. 26 Since the early 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood has played a notable political role in Palestine. However, until the outbreak of the Palestinian Intifada in December 1987, the group did not play an active role in confronting the Israeli occupation. Rather, its 69 leadership adopted a relatively passive ideology that considered its mission to be puri-Katayan and re-Islamization of society, a process that in their view should precede any confrontation with Israel's occupation. Its position led to a generational coup in the 1980s in the form of establishing Hamas. A generational coup was partly triggered by the emergence of a new faction under the name Islamic Jihad Movement in Palestine, Harakat ul-Jihad ul-Ismi Falastin, from within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. Islamic Jihad movement was inspired by the armed struggle of the nationalist factions and by the Iranian Revolution, 1979. Consequently, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood realized on the eve of the outbreak of the Intifada that if it did not listen to the young generation of activists, especially student activists, and join the national struggle against occupation, then it would lose its political legitimacy and influence within the Palestinian community. Therefore, its leadership agreed on 9 December 1987, the Intifada broke out, to establish an organizational framework for resistance against occupation. The Islamic Resistance Movement, Hamas, was declared on the 14th of December 1987. The movement distributed its founding statement on the 15th December 1987, and its charter was issued on the 18th of August 1988. C. Glenn E. Robinson, Hamas as Social Movement, in Quintan Wiktorowicz, ed. Islamic Activism, a Social Movement Eerie Approach, Indiana University Press, 2004, pp 112-39, Khalid Hraub, Hamas, Political Art and Practice, Washington, D.C., Institute for Palestine Studies, 2000, Tariq Bakoni, Hamas Contained, Rise and Parki Katayan of Palestinian Resistance, Stanford University Press, 2018, pp 17-28, Helger Baumgarten, Phases of Palestinian Nationalism, 1948-2005, Journal of Palestine Studies, Volume 34, Number 4, 2005, pp 25-48. Ziad Arbu Amr, Islamic Movement in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Arabic Acre, DA with Macron RLAS double, 1989, pp 34-5. Iyad Barghouti, Islamization and Politics in the Palestinian Occupied Territories, Arabic, Jerusalem, Israel Center for Studies and Research, 1990, page 61. Hani Awad, Understanding Hamas, Remarks on Redifferent and Interrelated Theoretical Approaches, Arabic Siyasat Arabiya, Volume 45, July 2020, pp 24-44. 27 Many Jewish Israeli individuals who were born in Israel have a second nationality, a foreign passport. Israelis immigrate to the US and to Europe in search for better life. Some friends of mine emigrated also for political reasons, or because they do not want to be a part of the Israeli reality that they feel they cannot change. But these are individual cases. As a whole, Israeli Jews have a collective national identity that links them to Israel as their homeland. 28 Historical Palestine is estimated to be 27,000 square kilometers, where the West Bank, 5,660 square kilometers, and Gaza Strip, 365 square kilometers, constitutes 22% of the total land. 29 from the source farther in Arabic, which means sacrifice for the sake of a cause. In this case it could mean the readiness of the Qtar to sacrifice his life. 30 off in different regions of Palestine, different kafirs and scarfs were worn, and there was no traditional uniform kuyar, but symbols must be uniform to be resonant. 31 Salim Tamari, Introduction, Palestine's Connexual Modernity, in Salim Tamari, Mountain Against the Sea, Essays on Palestinian Society and Culture, Berkeley, Los Angeles and London, University of California Press, 2009, pp 1-21, Issa Khalif, The Effect of Socio-Economic Change on Arab Societal Collapse in Mandate Palestine, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Volume 29, Number 1, 1997, pp 93-112. 32 Al-Hawt, Itamar Radai, A Rise and Fall of the Palestinian Arab Middle Class Under the British Mandate, 1920-39, Journal of Contemporary History, Volume 51, Number 3, 2016, pp. 70, 487-506. 33 on Haifa, C. Mayon Hillel, Constructing Modern Identity, New Patterns of Leisure and Recreation in Mandatory Palestine, Contemporary Levant, Volume 4, Number 1, 2019, pp 75-90. See also, Maisikali, Haifa, Transformation of an Arab Society, 1918-1939, Walid Khalidi, Forward, London, IB Torais, 2002. On Jerusalem, C. Salim Tamari, A Musician's Lot, Ijahariya Memoirs as a Key to Jerusalem's Early Modernity, in Tamari, Mountain Against the Sea, pp 71-92. On Safard, C. Mustafa Abbasi, Safard during the British Mandate Period, 1917-1948, A Social and Political Study, Arabic, Beirut and Ramallah, Institute for Palestine Studies, 2019. 34 Kimmeling and Migdal, page 57. 35 Rochelle Tack, Peasants into Workmen, Internal Labor Migration and the Arab Village Community Under the Mandate, in Joel S. Migdal, ed., Palestinian Society and Politics, Princeton, Princeton University Press, 2014, pp 261-86. 36 Palestinian historians have shown a lot of interest in the pre-1948 cities of Palestine. A motivation of many Palestinian researchers since the 1990s to write about the lost cities and the middle classes is understandable, insofar as these topics have been neglected by the historians of the Palestinian national movement, who emphasize the role of the traditional elites of the city, on the one hand, and the peasants on the other. A research on this subject, the preservation of family archives and photo collections, etc., signified a longing for a Palestinian normal and the promising modernity that was evolving between the two world wars in Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem and other cities. See Bashara Dumani, Rediscovering Palestine, Merchants and Peasants in Jabal Nablus, 1700-1900. Berkeley, University of California Press, 1995. Salim Tamari, Wasif Jahariya, Popular Music and Early Modernity in Jerusalem, in Rebecca L. Stein and Ted Swedenborg, eds. Palestine, Israel, and the Politics of Popular Culture, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, 2005, pp 27-50, Wasif Jawaria, Salim Tamari, and Assam Nassar, eds. A Storyteller of Jerusalem, E-Life and Times of Wasif Jaharia, 1904-1948, Northampton and Massachusetts, Olive Branch Press, 2014, Mahmoud Yazbek, Jafar Before the Nakba, Arabic, Journal of Palestine Studies, Volume 93, Winter 2013, pp 36-49, Sikali, Mana Hassan, Palestine's Absent Cities, Gender, Mamaricide and the Silencing of Urban Palestinian Memory, Journal of Holy Land and Palestine Studies, Volume 18, Number 1, 2019, pp 1-20, Bashara Dumarni, Archiving Palestine and the Palestinians, E-Patrimony of Hassan Nimr, Jerusalem Quarterly, Volume 36, No. 3-12, 2009.